I have one big idea I want to share with you today, and it drives to the heart of our work over the past 30 years. We began our work asking the question, are there moments of disproportionate influence in your life and in your leadership? So think about that for a moment. Are there moments of disproportionate influence where how you behave or how people in your organization behave disproportionately affects every outcome you care about? And if so, what are those moments? What kind of moments would matter the most? And then how should you show up in those moments? I was thinking about that. I want to introduce a metaphor. A few weeks ago, as I was driving to my office in the morning, and it was a cool day, and I pulled up at a stoplight behind a car. And I noticed the bumper on the back of the car had a big sign that said, student driver. I don't know about you, but this brought back memories for me. So I remembered the age, and I remembered the terror, and I remembered being worried about driving in front of my colleagues, and I worried that I wouldn't be able to see over the steering wheel, and all sorts of fears sort of combined in that one moment. So as I'm sitting back here kind of reminiscing about that, the light turns green, and this happened. You ever had a day like that? So this is the student driver pulling out, trying to follow instructions, and wham, terrible, awful accident. Nobody hurt, thank goodness. Everybody was fine. But as I drove off, I thought, there's a metaphor of life right there. I mean, we're all student drivers in the traffic of life. We all are. And we're all screwing up all the time. That's how life works. So back to the original thesis question. Are there moments of disproportionate influence? Are there moments where how you and I behave matters more than anything else to the health of our organizations, the health of our church, the health of our families, the health of our relationship? Well, to introduce the conclusion we came to in our research, I want to ask you to get a little bit more involved. So those of you who are watching on media, do the same thing. I want you to pair up. So look to your left, right, front, and back and find a reasonably intelligent person. Introduce yourself and pair up. You too, if you're watching somewhere else. Get a buddy. You need a buddy. Can't do this alone. All right, so if you've got a buddy, what I want you to do is decide who is person one and who's person two. Pick a one and a two. All right, nicely done. Look at us, leaping into action. Okay, person one, raise your hand. Person one. All right, when you watch the video, your name is going to be Rick. You're going to be a gentleman seated to the far left in the screen. He's wearing a yellow shirt, tall African-American man. All right, person two, raise your hand. Your name is Michael. You're going to be seated in the middle of this shot towards the back in the scene. Your name is Michael. Now, here's what's going to happen. I want you to watch this scene play out as your characters act out your lives. Those of you who are Rick, I want you to prepare because your job is to mentor Michael. You're a senior sales associate. Michael is kind of new. You're taking him on a sales call to try to show him the ropes. Now, this is a fairly easy sales call because the client's very interested and likely to commit. So you thought this would be an early win for Michael. So let's watch the scene play out, and then I'll describe your job. Here you go.
So thanks for agreeing to meet with us about your storage needs. I brought a junior sales associate with me today. This is Michael.
Nice to meet you.
You too. Well, I've looked at your proposal, and I have to say, I'm very interested.
Oh, that's great. As I've had a chance to review your backup infrastructure, and I don't want to be too critical here, but your platform is from when? The Jurassic era? Oh, very good. Thank you, Michael.
You're welcome.
So, how about we jump into our recommended solutions?
Sure. I know our tape system is a bit of a dinosaur, but...
Okay, Michael.
Oh, okay. All right.
Thank you.
we were
Okay.
hoping
Michael,
that our
Okay. All
work
right.
with you would,
Yes, Michael.
would increase the...
Mike.
So, do we have your business?
No.
All right, so here's the situation. You're now in the car on the drive back to the office, you and Michael. This is your big chance to offer some mentoring. So once again, those of you who are Michael, raise your hand. Michael, raise your hand. All right, I'm going to flash up on the screen your line. You're going to just say a line to Rick as you begin this tense conversation in the car on the way back. After you finish that line, those of you who are Rick, I just want you to respond. What would you say if you were Rick in these circumstances? So here you go. Michael, read your line. Go for it, Rick. All right. Let me pause you for a moment. So remember the thesis question. The question is, are there a few moments where how you behave disproportionately affects your relationships, your influence, your team, your organization, your church, your community? Are there a few of those kinds of moments? And if so, what are they? So our considered conclusion after 30 years of research is this: the health of a relationship, a team, or an organization is a function of the average time lag between identifying and discussing problems. That's it. You can guess, you can estimate, you can approximate the ability of an organization to execute on its mission, the ability of an organization to adapt and innovate to change. You can estimate its capacity to do that by measuring nothing more than that one concept. How long does it take between when problems are identified and when they're discussed? Think about it in a relationship. You know, you and your spouse go to a family gathering. Your spouse's mother reams out one of your children, uses abusive language towards them. You're in the car on the way back, and you know your spouse believes you've had it in for his mother-in-law for a long time. What happens around that issue? How does it get discussed? Does it get discussed? And how long does it take? In a team, what if you got a nurse on a shift who isn't answering the call lights, leaves the problems for others, and is gruff and irritable with patients, maybe even violates safety protocols? The question you need to ask is, how long does it take for that to bubble up? What's the lag time between identification and discussion in a healthy way? In an organization, I went to a restaurant that I used to like, and recently discovered that instead of the bread that they used to bring out and sit on the table, they now delivered a bowl of radishes. Who wants radishes? I don't want radishes. And I looked around, and every other table I saw had a big bowl chock full of radishes. No one's eating them. And I thought, musing to myself, how long will that take? How long will it take before some bright genius up there in product development gets the word that customers hate this? The health of a team, a relationship, an organization is a function of the average lag time between identifying and discussing problems. So we're looking for moments of disproportionate influence. We're wondering, are they there? And if so, how do people need to show up in those in order to help the organization move towards greater health? Well, our broader research suggests these are the moments. It's when somebody breaks a promise, violates an expectation, or behaves badly. And it turns out we all experience it all the time. 95% of people in one of our studies say, yeah, I've got coworkers who are conniving, dishonest, lazy, irritable. They've got coworkers who they struggle with. We're all students. We're all student drivers in the traffic of life. We all make mistakes. The question is not whether people are going to behave badly. The question is, how in your relationships, teams, and organizations do we respond when that occurs? Well, let's take a look. 3 out of 4 people in this study said that these individuals with whom they have concerns aren't just irritating, they're creating profound problems. 3 out of 4 say these are severe problems for customers, the organization, for costs or productivity. So these are big deals. The question you need to ask in a leader is, what are you doing to create an organization where those problems are confronted, discussed, and resolved in a healthy way? The majority of people say it's not happening where they work. In fact, they say these problems persist for years. The question we asked was, why? What's the human mechanism that allows that underperforming nurse or that problem employee or colleague? What's the mechanism? What's the human behavior that enables and allows that to go unaddressed for such a long period of time so customers are getting radishes far longer than they should? Well, I got kind of an anecdotal answer to that a number of years back. My son had to do a science fair project. And he came to me and said, "Dad, will you help me with the project?" I said, "Absolutely, Samuel." He said, "All I need is help organizing the project." I said, "Really, you got an idea?" He said, "Yes." And I said, "What are you going to do?" He says, "I want to test how people respond when you go out into public and do irritating things." I said, "How is this different than your regular life?" He rolled his eyes and he said, "Well, I'm going to measure it this time." So he went to a mall during a busy holiday time when there were lots and lots of protracted lines, people waiting. And he interviewed 25 people prior to conducting the experiment. And he asked them, if somebody cut in line in front of you, what would you do? If somebody cut in line in front of you, how would you respond? Out of 25 people, about 18 said some version of, well, I would tap them on the shoulder and I'd say we're in line, or some version of that. So 18 out of 25 predicted that they would confront this accountability problem if and when it occurred. Well, then he did the actual experiment. Let's see what happened.
Here's my experiment. Different people cut in busy lines during the holidays. What you can't hear is what they're saying under their breath, just loud enough for the line cutter to hear it. Now watch these girls. I get right in front of them and they say nothing. Watch as these girls come into focus. You can see the one on your right hates my guts. But does she talk to me? No. The one on the left thinks if she makes faces at the back of my head, it might help. It doesn't. Now here goes my mom. Never has a mother done more for her son than this. After 24 line cuttings, no one has spoken up. Now, watch the woman in the white sweater. She's got guts. She taps my mom on the shoulder and says, "Who does your hair?"
Isn't that remarkable? Out of 25 people, 18 predicted they'd do something, but when we're in those exact emotional circumstances, when we're in what psychologists call a hot mode, we behave far differently than even we predict. We tend not to show up. So there's the problem. That's why they persist for 5 years or longer. That's why the health of your marriage, your family, your organization, your team are so inextricably connected to the time lag between identifying and discussing problems. And then not just discussing them, but discussing them in a healthy way that leads to resolution. Now think about it for a moment. This is the story of the Bible as well. You go back through sacred literature and the inflection points are precisely the same. It's when an accountability problem occurs, when somebody behaves badly, breaks a promise, violates an expectation. It starts with God and Adam and Eve. It continues with Abraham and Sarai. It continues with Sarai and Hagar. It continues with Jacob and Esau. All the way through, the inflection points where the story pivots is whether and how people show up in those moments when I'm disappointed, when I'm hurt, when I'm frustrated. So, we spent much of the last 30 years roaming across the world trying to say, are there positive deviants out there? Are there people who speak up, who hold accountability conversations and do so in a way that leads to better outcomes, that takes advantage of those moments of disproportionate influence in a way that works? Well, we found that they were. And so we began studying in careful detail how they show up. What are some of the skills and practices that lead to different kinds of outcomes? Here they are. Now, there's a much larger set, but in the limited time we've got, what I want you to do is get an appreciation for just these three. If you could hang on to 3 ideas that would profoundly affect your capacity, not just to show up quickly, but to show up well during these moments. These are 3 that I'd like to emphasize. Here's the first. We call it suspend judgment. Now, I don't want this to be abstract for you, so I want to take you to a very concrete place. Here it is. This is called Lincoln High School. One of the places that I was most interested in studying how people deal with accountability problems was a place where there are lots of them. Lincoln High School in Walla Walla, Washington, at least at the beginning of our story, was a place where there were rampant problems and disorder. This is an alternative high school, last chance. You flunk out of this one, you're on the streets. So most of the kids had kind of a tough background already. The principal, prior to our story beginning, had an average of 700 reportable police-involved incidents per year. 700. Someone bringing a weapon to school, someone selling drugs, a gang fight happening in the hallway. It was absolute pandemonium. Lots of opportunity for accountability. Now, I was interested in this school because over a period of 2 years, the number of incidents dropped from 700 to 200, all because of the arrival of this man, a man by the name of Jim Sporlater. Now, I was interested in Jim because he had focused on these moments of accountability, these moments of disproportionate influence, and he'd found a way to show up completely differently. For example, one day, one of his reportable incidents was Emilio. Emilio and two of his buddies were behind the gym, and they had a bag of marijuana. They began preparing it for consumption so they could further damage their cognitive capacity. And why is it always behind the gym? I mean, what is it about? Anyway, for future research. So they're all huddled behind the gym with a bag of weed when the student resource officer walks up and discovers them. When they see him, they panic and cover up and toss the marijuana far enough away that it can't be attributed to any one particular person. So the student resource officer detains the three of them, brings them into Sporlater's office, drops them down. Sporlater walks in. He's offended. He's upset. He has 3 cardinal rules in this school: no violence, no drugs, right? And no threats of violence. He says, these are the 3 things you have to do. So now seated in front of him is Emilio with an angry, ugly stare, a provocative face, sort of a just try it look on his face. Now the question is, how do you start? How would you begin an accountability conversation in such a context? Well, Sporlater taught me some really powerful lessons, and here was the first. He says the first is that you and I have a tendency during those moments. When somebody breaks a promise to us, violates an expectation, or behaves badly, something happens inside of us. The first thing is we personalize. We make it about us. Sporlater says the thing I have to remind myself is it's never about me. Wait a minute. The fact that that kid is sitting here looking at me with a defiant stare, that's not about me? Yeah, that's right. Please repeat with me. It is never, 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 never. How often? Yes, about you. It's never about you. Now, the problem is that our tendency during these moments is to create a story for ourselves that makes it about us. So I want you to memorize this model. This is what we discovered by watching people who are terrific at holding people accountable. We call this the path to action. You'll notice on the far right end is the word act. That means ultimately at the end of this experience, this model, you're going to behave. You're going to say something to Emilio. Words are going to come out of your mouth. You're going to respond. That's the end. The beginning of the process is you see or hear something. I got a kid with a scowl on his face sitting here staring at me. So something begins. 3 kids, bag of marijuana out behind the gym, him staring at me. It ends with me acting. Now, in between is the magical part. It's the place where Sporlater shows up differently than you and I. The next step in the process after that experience happens is you and I do something with it. We tell a story. We tell a story. Now, we tell it in very, very predictable ways. Psychologists have demonstrated there are 2 very common mechanisms for how we tell stories. I want to illustrate that with one of my own. So a number of years back, I got invited to go to a speaking engagement at Pebble Beach, fabulous golf place. And I'm not a big golfer, wasn't at the time, but I had a son who was. Every year I try to take my kids to a place that they would love to go to, that I'm traveling to, and spend an extra day or 2 with them. So I said to Samuel, would you like to go to Pebble Beach? His eyes grew as big as saucers, and he said, oh, absolutely, that would be wonderful. And so we scheduled a time. We flew into San Jose, we drove down to Carmel, we checked in, we had a day of golf. It was a fabulous experience. And as we were just getting prepared to go to bed the night before we would leave, I saw him meander into the pro shop. And he started looking around at some of the racks and memorabilia. And I finally saw him looking longingly at this windbreaker. And I said, hey, Samuel, I'm thinking to myself, I haven't paid a dime for this trip. The client covered the golf, so I could spring for a gift for my son. And I said, you want to try that on? He said, oh, Dad, could I? And I said, certainly you may. And so I put it on, and it looked handsome on him. And I said, would you like that? And he said, yeah, I really would. And I hadn't checked the price tag. It was like, $9 million or something like that. Maxed out my credit card, but we bought it for him, and he was so happy. And I thought he'll remember this at least until he grows out of the windbreaker in a year. So the next morning, we get up bright and early, too early to be able to get breakfast at the hotel. We drove back to San Jose, and rushing onto the plane, since he was starving, he wanted to grab some food, and there was a little stand that sold French toast sticks. So he bought the French toast sticks, stuffed them in the bag. We got onto the plane. He puts down the tray, and he opens these up. And just as the plane is taking off, he's got the French toast sticks sitting on the table, his windbreaker all zipped up and handsomely arrayed. And then he gets this big, giant tub full of maple syrup. And he starts pulling at the foil top on this, trying to get it open. And I'm watching this with a little nervousness. And finally, after pulling with all his might, it goes shoo, like this. And literally, this maple syrup springs up into the air and in slow motion drops down and goes whap all across the front of his windbreaker. Well, I'm sitting here next to him. Remember the path to action model, right? You see or hear something, and then what do you do next? You tell a story. So here's what starts to happen inside of Joseph. I'm staring at him, waiting for him to register some appreciative response to the fact that he's just damaged this priceless piece of sportswear. There's none. He grabs the French toast sticks and starts plunging it down into this and putting it into his mouth, and it's drooling down his chin and dribbling down the front of this windbreaker. And I'm sitting here thinking, you irresponsible, you unappreciative, you hear it happening? The story starts to get told. Let me give you a quick illustration of this. A woman asked me a while back for some help with a crucial conversation she needed to have. She said, I just found out that over the past 6 months, my husband has had lunch with his ex-girlfriend. Now, when she told me that, when she gave me that information, when I saw and heard that description, stuff started happening in my mind. Did it in yours? How many of you just added some things to the story? Yeah. Turn to your partner and share with them 3 things you just added. Go, real quick. What did you add to the story? All right. Did you notice that you did? Did you notice that the story gained a lot in color and character and all sorts of things? How many of you, for example, could see the lunch location? How many of you had a mental picture of, did it have a drive-through? No. What did the restaurant look like? There was candle lights and a white linen tablecloth, right? And it's not plasticware. There's no spork in this place, right? Yeah, we have a picture of it. How did he feel about being at the lunch? He was happy to be at the lunch, right? He wasn't reluctant. We added that to the story. How many lunches were there? Yeah. Now remember the story. The story was over the past 6 months, he's what? He's had lunch with his ex-girlfriend. Do we know in the story how many times he had it? What's the minimum? 1. What's the maximum? 180 in 6 months apparently. So the story didn't tell us. We had to add that. That's what we do predictably. Now, I don't know about you, but I have mental pictures of every aspect of that story that I was adding to it. So what do we tend to do? Anytime you feel triggered by somebody's misbehavior, violated expectations, or broken promises, anytime I react emotionally, I've told a story. And the two patterns in that story that we know from research, you and I do over and over again, is we personalize and we villainize. We make it about us. It's not that he's having lunch with her, it's that he's doing something behind my back. It's not that Emilio has a scowl on his face, it's that he's scowling at me. It's not that he used weed in the school, it's that he broke my rule. We personalize it, we make it about us. If you do that, you fail. You'll show up in your accountability conversation in a way that will provoke defensiveness rather than learning. It won't lead to healthy outcomes. Most of our upsets in these accountability moments, now it's not that we won't be bothered or annoyed or put out that they didn't keep their commitments to us, but most of the amplification of that emotion comes not from their action, but my shame. We all carry with us fears about ourselves, that others will see us as incompetent, as evil, or as worthless. Those are the three. We have fears that them doing this means something about either my ability or my motive or my value as a human being. And our personalization of that is what gets in the way of our having healthy conversations at times. So problem one is personalization. Problem two is villainization. There are two things we've got to do to overcome these. The first is recognize it's never about us. The second is learn to separate fact from story. So I'm sitting here next to Samuel. He's got stuff drooling down the front of him. And I'm thinking to myself, he's unappreciative, he's disrespectful, he's taking advantage of me. All this stuff starts to go on. I'm personalizing it, but I'm also villainizing him. I make him evil, awful, and bad. And when you do that, you justify yourself in showing up in a way that causes harm rather than learning. That's a student driver in the traffic of life. Our job is to help them learn. And my friends, my personal conviction is the way you show up in these moments is the greatest expression of your Christian walk. The way we show up in these moments of disproportionate influence is our greatest opportunity to develop the kind of character that we're trying to create and also to have the kind of influence we want to have in the world. So, what do we have to learn to do? We got to learn to avoid the second problem, the villainization problem. Psychologists call this the fundamental attribution error. Now, it's called fundamental because you and I tend to do it all the time. When people cause us pain or inconvenience, we tend to attribute it to bad motive. See, here's how you create bad feelings. If you ever want to create negative emotions, if you don't have enough of them in your life, I want to teach you how to do it more routinely and efficiently. So here you go. The first thing you got to do if you want to create an emotion called frustration is you need to tell a story that says they're doing that because they're stupid. So it's a competence problem. They are incompetent. They're doing it because they're an idiot, right? So if you can attribute something to their global incompetence, then I can feel irritated at them and impatient towards them. But if you ever want to feel angry, that story won't get you there. If you want to feel indignant and offended and angry towards them, here's the story you got to tell. They're doing it because they're evil. That's why they're doing it. They are enjoying causing me suffering. So why is Samuel sitting here dropping this all over his windbreaker? It's because he doesn't care about the things I do for him. He has bad motives. Now, as I sit here stewing on this, it creates this indignation, and I was ready to just rip into him, to correct him, to let him know that was wrong and inappropriate, and he was being bad and irresponsible, all these judgments about him being evil. And then I started to try to play with that story. I tried to attack it. I tried to change it. Why is that important? Because here's what we know. If you attribute the problem immediately to bad motives, they're doing this on purpose to me. If you go that route, there's less than a 6% chance that you're going to come up with a healthy solution to your problem. You learn to challenge your story, you learn to change your story, you learn to show up differently in these moments and suspend judgment. If you learn to do that, there's about a 96% chance that you'll be heard, that you'll have an influence. Does this mean they'll agree with you? No, not necessarily. It means you'll be able to have a conversation. You'll be able to share your concerns and your perspective. So what do you have to do? That's it. You got to learn to, number one, own the fact that you created that story. And number two, attack it, beat on it, challenge it, change it, suspend it. How do you do that? By reversing the personalization, by asking yourself intentionally, not what does this mean about me, but what does it mean about you? What does it mean about Emilio sitting here in my office, that he's using weed behind the school? This isn't about me and my rules and all of that kind of stuff. This is about him. But second, it's what I had to do on the plane with Samuel. I sat here thinking to myself all of the personalization and villainization, and then I started to ask, why would a reasonable, rational, decent 10-year-old do that? The first answer I came up with was, he wouldn't. And then I challenged it again. Why would a reasonable, rational, decent 10-year-old do that? And pretty soon what came up in my mind was not that he was an irresponsible and unappreciative and uncaring and narcissistic 10-year-old, but rather that he was a normal little boy. How differently would you respond if your story was normal little boy versus unappreciative brat? Would it change? Would it shift? Well, this is what you got to learn to do. And then what? Then you got to learn to describe your problem, not with all of your malice and anger and judgment. So what do I say next? I described to Samuel the concern. I said, Samuel, you just tore the top off of your maple syrup tub and it spilled down the front of your jacket. That's all you have to do. Facts only. No judgments, no accusations, no emotion, no malice. Just facts first. So what do you do if you got Emilio in the office? Here's the first line coming out of Jim Sporlater's mouth. It follows this exactly, describing the gap between what he expected and what he observed, between how Emilio should be behaving and how he is behaving. Facts first, no judgments, no accusations. He says to him, hey, Emilio, the student resource officer said that 3 of you were behind the gym a little while ago and a bag of marijuana was found just a few feet away. That's it. That's it. Now I've started the conversation. I suspend judgment so I can do it in a civil and respectful way, and now I describe the facts. Now that gets tough. When people behave in ways and we tell stories about them, you and I want to start our conversation by saying, you know what, you're kind of controlling, or you're sort of irresponsible, or you're kind of self-centered. Those aren't facts, those are stories. My wife came to me a couple of years after we got married, and we just finished a dinner party with some friends. And she said, Joseph, can I give you some feedback? And I said, what kind? And she said, well, I think this will help you grow and it will help you to behave better at dinner parties. I thought, what a wonderful objective. So I said, what's the feedback? She said, well, I don't know quite how to say this, but you eat like a pig. Now, is eat like a pig a fact or a story? It's a story, right? It's a judgment that I've added to it. But I want you to think for a moment, what facts would support eat like a pig? Turn to your partner for just a second. Come up with one fact that would cause you to say, Joseph eats like a pig. What might I have been doing? What's the actual behavior? All right. Now, I don't know what your picture was of me, but when I got underneath that to the facts, when I understood what she was describing, one of them was, she says, Joseph, you eat 4 bites for every 1 bite everybody else at the table takes. Now, is that fact or story? No, she had a stopwatch. It's fact, yeah. There was certifiable data there. She says, secondly, the velocity with which your spoon approaches your mouth causes it to clang against your teeth when you're eating, and so it makes this ricocheting sound across the table. Well, I thought, those are 2 things I can understand. I can work on that. But you and I so often have a tendency to come into our accountability conversations with accusations and judgments. And often the facts we share are grossly exaggerated. If you ever use the phrase, you always or you never, you're almost always in story, not fact. Exaggerated facts are almost always a sign of unvalidated emotions. You have emotions, you have anger, you're still personalizing or villainizing, and that's creeping out in your description of the problem. So go back to step 1. So let's put all this together. You know, you're talking to Emilio. Now, how do you do this? How do you suspend judgment? How do you then describe the gap? You suspend judgment by making it about him, not about you. By asking, why would a reasonable, rational, decent teenager be behind the gym using marijuana with his friends? And then by describing the facts to open the conversation with them. But the last step in the process is now having a dialogue. It's engaging the other person. You got to get yourself to a place of curiosity and openness so that you can gather more facts, and then you have a chance to make a judgment. You know what? This is not about permissiveness. If he had violated the law or the rules of the school, he needs to be held accountable. This isn't about being weak or compromising the standards of the school. This is about gathering information so that you make accurate judgments. So what does Sporlater do? He says, so there's the problem, Emilio. He says, but let me ask you a question. He said, on a scale of 1 to 10, where's your stress level? And Emilio's eyes open big. He hadn't expected that question, but it's coming from a place of curiosity in Dr. Sporlater. Emilio says, well, probably a 9. Sporlater says, it's a 9 right now. How's it been over the last few weeks? He says, a 9. Sporlater says, I don't know how you would function at a stress level of 9. How do you show up to school? How do you get your work done? He said, do you want to talk about that? What's going on? His chin started to quiver. He sat back in his chair and his face relaxed. Sporlater says, something's happened, hasn't it? And Emilio says it has. He said about 6 months ago, he was living with his grandmother. He said their house caught on fire and the two of them escaped through different exits. He says he managed to grab the cat before they exited the house, and the two of them stood there looking at each other and hugging, and then realized that his little sister was still in the house. He said he tried to rush back into the house but was detained by one of the fire officials who said, you can't go back in. He said he fought and fought for 20 minutes against the fire department official while his sister perished in the fire. Sporlater said, dear God, he said, and you've been carrying that for the past 6 months. And then they had a conversation. Emilio still had to go to detention. He still had to be suspended. There were requirements, but guess who showed up at detention? Jim Sporlater, and gave him a hug and checked on him. And they talked about counseling resources. I had a chance to talk with Emilio about this experience. I want you to listen to how he responded to being held accountable in this way.
Well, I was suspended for a couple of days, and I figured it was probably a good time to think about why I was doing the things I was doing. I wasn't angry at all towards them. They care for their students and then, care for me, and I appreciated it. And I just wanted to think about how I was affecting people around me by doing the things that I was doing, and I didn't really like it, so I wanted to change it the best I could. Yeah, I didn't ask myself, I should have not gotten caught, or, I should have been smarter and not gotten caught in the first place. I figured, it was a good time to, stop smoking weed altogether, and it's been a while, actually, since I have.
Isn't that remarkable? He went to student detention, he was suspended, he was held accountable, and yet rather than going home and feeling justified and angry and rebellious, he was reflective. He thought about it, he owned it. He started going to counseling services. He started taking classes at night in auto repair. He finished high school. He graduated last June. In preparation to talk with you today, I called him 2 days ago and said, Emilio, how's it going? And when's the last time he used drugs? He said, I've been clean for over a year. He's graduated high school and is waiting to get into the National Guard. He's making something of his life. And as we finished the conversation, he said, have you seen Dr. Sporlater lately? And I said, I'll be talking to him in a couple of days. And he said, please tell him I love him. My friends, these are the moments of disproportionate influence. Whether we show up and how we show up in these moments is the determinant of the quality of our relationships, our teams, and our organizations. If you aren't actively improving how you do that, you're stuck in some way in your life. If you aren't actively building a culture in your organization where people know how to show up in this way effectively and consistently, then problems are lagging, problems are getting buried, and the capacity of the entire organization to achieve its mission is being fundamentally inhibited. I wish you the best as you go forth and work on your capacity to seize these moments of influence in a way that blesses lives, improves organization, and changes the world. Thank you very much.